So welcome to tonight's webinar, Allensworth, Black History and Reparations. My name is Oliver Rosales. I'm a professor of history at Bakersfield College, and I want to say I'm at the Delano campus this evening, which is about 10 miles southeast of Allensworth, California, which is the subject of tonight's discussion and event and presentation by Dr. Ashley Adams. I also want to mention that tonight's event, there's a lot of folks and supporters involved. A quick shout out to Andrew Bond, who you've been hearing speaking, a professor of English, who helps coordinate all of the programming that we do with the Social Justice Institute going back several years. I want to thank the folks in events management who helped get the webinar going tonight. And I especially want to thank our funders, the Whiting Foundation, based in New York, which is supporting some programming that we're doing this spring related to culturally responsive teaching and place-based education here in the San Joaquin Valley. Tonight's event, I want to kick us off very briefly by sharing a picture. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. I'm going to try to maximize it just for a second here to kind of set the stage, so to speak. So Allensworth, California, a place that some of you might have heard of, others might not have any clue what it is. This photograph comes from Watts, California in 1973 at a summer festival within a predominantly African-American community. This is 8 years after the 1965 Watts riots, which witnessed police violence and social protest by African-Americans in Los Angeles. And there was a group from Allensworth, California, that made it a point to go to Los Angeles. And if you look at the image on the car, it says Allensworth, City of Black Hope. And I want you to meditate on that as you listen to Dr. Ashley Adams tonight talk about Allensworth and how it connects to memory and reparations, because the city of Allensworth was founded over a century ago, and even as late as the 1970s, after the sort of heyday of the history of Allensworth in the sort of Black imagination, it was a place of freedom. It was a place of imagination, and in this case, this idea that it was a city of Black hope. So it's within that spirit that I'm going to introduce to you now our speaker, Dr. Ashley Adams. And I'm just going to read her bio because it's very impressive, and I want to do her justice here. Ashley Adams serves as acting director of the public policy and is associate adjunct professor of public policy at Mills College at Northeastern University. She is a descendant of early settlers of the historic Black town and federally designated site, Nicodemus, Kansas. Dr. Adams has primarily dedicated her research platform to improving Black history preservation practices within national and state preservation systems. Dr. Adams was featured in the CalAg Roots California Humanities National Endowment for the Humanities podcast entitled We Are Not Strangers Here, specifically episode 5 entitled Back to the Land, Allensworth and the Black Utopian Dream. And I will say, Ashley, it's an excellent podcast. I share it with my students going back to when it came out. She also serves as board secretary for the Nicodemus Historical Society and as the Nicodemus Kansas site coordinator for the Voices and Votes Democracy in America 2023 Smithsonian exhibit in partnership with Kansas Humanities, the Nicodemus Historical Society, and the National Park Service. She is also founding co-chair for the Black Reparations Project at Mills College at Northeastern University, a newly formed academic initiative that provides reparations policy analysis services and formal reparations learning opportunities and maintains continuous documentation of reparations movement works. So having said that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Adams, and I'll just say, as I said to you at the beginning, Ashley, the last time I was with you, we were in Las Vegas at a conference talking about the San Joaquin Valley, and I was so pleased that you're there and so excited to have you here at Bakersfield College, and we look forward to your presentation. And for anybody who's in the audience, again, feel free to use the chat or question and answer function, and we'll get to those after Dr. Adams' presentation. So, Ashley.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rosales, and thank you, Andrew. I'd like to say thank you to the Social Justice Institute for inviting me to speak this evening. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And let me know that it's working. Can you see it?
It looks good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for inviting me today. I'm really excited about this talk. I am going to jump right into it. Before I begin today, whenever I talk about this, I always like to just, establish a community agreement, because some of the things that I'm going to talk about can be triggering for some people. And I just like to acknowledge that and encourage you to consider your self-care and your grounding in this conversation. We are talking about race, we're talking about racism and other things that, can be triggering. And so I'd also just like to request that we can keep a safe space for dialogue afterwards with our Q&A. And this evening, this is my agenda. I'm going to provide an overview of the research that we've done in Allensworth for the last couple of years. And then I'm going to talk about the larger picture in terms of public memory impacts and Black history preservation failures and the larger consequences to society to those things. And then I'm going to share our recommendations for action, which I will tell you before I begin, they have changed over the years since we started this work. There's been a lot that has happened. And so I have a lot to share with you today. And then after that, we'll do the audience Q&A. So before I talk about the Allensworth research, I do want to acknowledge my own ancestors. This is something that I like to do before I talk about this, because it's important for me to, share how and why I got into this work myself. And my ancestors are definitely at the root of that. I'm a fourth generation descendant of early settlers of the town Nicodemus, Kansas, who were formerly enslaved individuals. And this is my great-great-grandparents. These are my great-great-grandparents, John and Leanna Samuels. They were separated during slavery for most of their marriage. My great-great-grandfather learned how to read in secret at night. He was a slave in a hemp factory in Kentucky, and he was purchased for $1,600 as a farmhand in Missouri, close towards the end of slavery. My great-great-grandpa Sam was a Buffalo soldier. My cousin Lula was the first Nicodemus town historian, and her unpublished manuscript offered to us the stories of our ancestors, and it is housed at the University of Kansas in the Spencer Research Library in Lawrence, Kansas, at my old school that I used to go to. And so it's the only documented history of the stories of the early Nicodemus settlers. So she's very special. She's a she-wrote to many of us in Nicodemus. I also want to acknowledge my beautiful grandmother, Leota, who was a business owner and an entrepreneur. She made something out of nothing. She started her clothing business, Leota's Fashions, where she sold women's clothing and accessories in the Kansas City area, and she was a pillar in her community. And my great-grandpa, George, who was an instrument repairman. And he and other members of my family were robbed of their entire city and home in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where he was burned over a large percentage of his body, but he survived to tell the story. I'm sharing these brief stories of my ancestors because they are a reminder of why and how we are here. And I always encourage folks in this conversation to do the same. This is my positionality in this work. And my ancestors are, why I do this work. And so their stories inspire me to advocate for their memory and for healing in the Black community and for future generations. And they're the reason why I'm here. And I just, like to acknowledge that this is what started my path with my dissertation years ago, and, trying to uplift these stories. And so these were real people and their stories matter. So after the Civil War, communities like Nicodemus, Kansas served as a symbol of hope and wealth for Black settlers. Land ownership was regarded as an emblem of expanded freedom and independence for African Americans at the time. And under land ownership policies like the Homestead Act of 1862, they could become landowners, living on the land and growing crops. And those that were able to travel to Nicodemus and claim land experienced extreme challenges during the first few years. They lived in dugouts. They experienced harsh homesteading conditions. They faced racism. But despite these living conditions, this town, Nicodemus, ended up having over 600 plus settlers, and at one time was a booming Black community. And Nicodemus is one of the few surviving all Black towns from the post-Reconstruction era. And in 1976, Nicodemus was designated a National Historic Landmark. And in 1996, 5 historic buildings were designated as a Nicodemus National Historic Site. And today, that park is managed by the National Park Service and in partnership with the Nicodemus Historical Society and other, preservation groups that are partners to Nicodemus. And so Colonel Allensworth, California, was founded some 30 years after the establishment of Nicodemus. And this was in 1908. And Allensworth was a former Navy officer, a Baptist minister, and he too was a former slave. And he and other early settlers founded this town, and the California State Park and Recreation manages this park. So Allensworth is a state historic park. Nicodemus is a federal designated park managed by the National Park Service. And so Allensworth State Historic Park was designated in 1974, and they reconstructed the town, including Colonel Allensworth's house, the schoolhouse, the library, the church, and other buildings. And like Nicodemus, Allensworth has its own unique African-American history. It is also founded with the hope of, just like in the picture, a city of Black hope that Dr. Rosales showed us earlier. It was founded with the hope of providing land ownership, and it was, highly sought after by its settlers. And the settlers of Allensworth were a little bit, more advanced than the ones in Nicodemus, because this was, later in time for one. And many of the settlers in Allensworth actually were previously landowners. Many of them were military men, belonged to social clubs, and were, had money of their own. And so Allensworth actually, they had intended to have Tuskegee of the West, an industrial school that would be fashioned after the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And despite all these grand plans that they had, the town of Allensworth met a similar fate as Nicodemus, unfortunately. And in its aftermath, despite both of these towns, being noteworthy of government preservation designations, what we saw was underrepresented preservation in terms of, most people have never heard of these places. And that's where it all started. And so people always ask me, where are these places? If you do not know, here they are on the map. Nicodemus is about 5 hours that way from Kansas City. And Allensworth is about in the middle of California. Those of you that are in Bakersfield, I'm sure you know where it is. And so what we did was to learn more about the preservation policy goals and the outcomes. We interviewed 20 plus people who were key partners from Nicodemus and Allensworth, and we conducted interviews with residents, descendants, non-descendant area residents, educational institutions who were partners, who had partnerships with both of these places, representatives from like higher educational institutions, community organization, representatives and California state parks or National Park Service workers. And we also review park planning documents, their policies, their practices, and other previous related research, and all of their planning documents and all of those things. And the data from our study was used to develop preservation improvement suggestions, which we did both for Nicodemus and Allensworth. And I have been doing in Nicodemus for several years now. And we've made a lot of progress with the work that we are doing. And even in Allensworth too, there's a lot of things happening. So what I would like to share is some of the problems that came out. There definitely were some positive things that came out of that research, and there's some positive updates that I'm going to share in the next slide. But these are some of the original issues that we found. One is underrepresented African-American units within these preservation systems, both on a state level and a federal level. As I said before, most people have never heard of these places or don't know their history. They are taught in some public schools, taught in some college classrooms, but not necessarily something that's required to be taught. Then we had the need for African-American and descendant volunteers and park workers. Both of these places had dwindling numbers and hardly any young people engaged, on a regular, consistent basis. Also, both places had mostly white staff and management for most of the time as their historic designation location. And then there was the issues of the preservation of the buildings and the landscapes being poorly maintained and just not, receiving the resources needed for that. This is an issue that is actually an issue at most public parks and units, whether it be state or federal. It extends to a larger issue of a maintenance backlog. But because we're talking about Black history, this is a separate type of issue that needs a separate type of attention to it. And in 2020, the Nicodemus National Historic Site had a growing maintenance backlog totaling approximately $722,000. And Allensworth had a guesstimated $750,000, so almost about the same. And then there was also water and environmental issues. With the water and environmental issues for local residents, we see in both of these places, they're both experiencing these things. Even though it's different types of issues, they're both still there. And so that was a factor that we weren't necessarily looking for, but it was a major thing that came up, and it definitely impacts the local communities that live there. And also have historical roots to the original town developments, because the original issues that some of the settlers were facing in Allensworth had to deal with the toxic water, which those are things that they're still dealing with today, although they are trying to make some efforts to work on that today. And so then there's also the issue of no local economy, the location not being ideal, both of them being in rural areas with small populations, long-term need for government resources and economic development. Then we also had no permanent visitor center after 20 plus years. I do want to say that both locations are now working on building new visitor centers. At the time when we did this originally a couple of years ago, that was, still a topic of discussion. But now we actually see some finances that are being put towards that. And that goes for both Nicodemus and Allensworth. So we're really excited to see that happening finally. There's been past issues of mismanagement of money, lack of partnership development, lack of descendant involvement, lack of funds and resources, and just an overall lack of strategic preservation and business planning. All of these are indicators of a larger problem, and we propose that other historic Black towns and spaces are experiencing similar conditions, such as these noted here. Maybe not all of these, but just, these things do show up. The Center for the Great Plains of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln uplifted and noted these other Black homesteads through their research documentation with an aim to disseminate the story of Black homesteading in the Great Plains. And this is a short list in a specific geographic area, but there are so many more, and we propose that these types of issues extend beyond Black towns and into Black historic places and spaces in general. And so some of these places, you know, that are noted here, they do have extra efforts to address similar issues. And so these are some of the positive updates that I want to highlight that are happening right now that I think, you know, it's definitely worth mentioning. The $40 million that Governor Newsom put into the budget for a new visitor center and to address environmental issues in Allensworth. Also, that they are centralizing their events with other parks to try to gain more exposure and outreach. They are engaging in annual trainings for human rights and making an effort to center Black voices and to work with Black partners, even though their staff is predominantly white. They are making those efforts to try to be inclusive in that way. And so I think that is important to mention because that needs to be happening everywhere. Also during the pandemic, they increased their virtual education programming, which, you know, allow for better outreach. And another thing that happened on the state level was free admission for California families with the Cal State Park Adventure Pass. And so you can actually visit Allensworth for free. There's not an access barrier there. And there's also new partnerships for community and economic development in Allensworth and in Nicodemus too. So, you know, people are paying attention and they are trying to work to address some of the issues that we found originally a few years ago when we started this research. So that is pretty much our research in a nutshell. Now what I want to do is move into the larger impacts on public memory and just larger consequences in general when we think about the landscape right now that's happening in our country as it relates to racism, as it relates to public education and public understanding of Black history, and how it connects back to this work that we're doing. And so when we, you know, think about the larger societal consequences of poor public memory of Black history, you might have heard the term of hidden history, or I've said several times, underrepresented history. What exactly does that mean? It's forgotten history, little known history, shameful history, selective history, where we're missing information or stories of the Black experience from past to present in public memory. And when I say public memory, I'm talking about the commonly shared pools of knowledge of past events. And history is expressed through monuments, it's expressed through memorials, you know, storytelling, public education, media, movies, books, plays, music, other forms of arts. And, you know, we're seeing a lot of debates across the country right now on public memory in terms of Confederate monuments and how or whether or not Black history should be taught. Black history in general is considered underrepresented in public memory or entirely unknown or limitedly known to the American public in many instances. And so there we turn back and look at the underpreservation and what are the preservation practices that are contributing to that. And so public memory of Black history since slavery is extremely valuable for improving race relations and the Black experience. Here in this image on this slide, we see the face of George Floyd being protected on the base of the statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia. And it is a symbol of the deep confliction that we must face in confronting commemoration and memorialization of not just the Civil War, but all that came after emancipation. There is so much more to share about this statue, which was eventually removed. And, you know, there's a lot to share about this story, which I don't have time to go into. But the big message here is that this is one example of so many more across the nation, which includes discussions on the reinterpretation of history, the values and the perspectives and the impacts that these symbols have on our lives, like literally, and encouraging African Americans to record and document their experiences during the Civil War. African American abolitionist Frederick Douglass once emphasized the act of memory being given to humans for a reason. And so when we think about memorials and monuments being considered, you know, as abridged representations of historical happenings, We want to think about, what those interpretations actually mean and how they impact our shared memories and how we engage with each other. Just yesterday, I attended a Black History Month event that was sponsored by my cousin, Dr. Gail Cummings, and she said something that I want to share with you. Just, sharing and thinking and commemorating Black history, it reinforces Black lives as human beings, and it, reinforces the contributions of Black people. And so that's what really this is all about. When we think about public memory, we should also think about narratives. Stories build narratives. Narratives are our cultural understandings and frames of reference. And when we think about public memory, we're usually downloading that in the method of stories or, in the method of narratives. We should also acknowledge that narratives are culture changing. They can change culture. And so narrative changing is an actual form of government intervention. The government, will take action to attempt to change culture or change narrative about something. And this is what, we need with this situation here. And so that's why I'm sharing this, to acknowledge it from a public policy standpoint. I want to also offer this quote by Judith Register that says, narratives shape our perceptions form our realities influence our choices and our actions, and narratives shape opportunities and how groups see themselves as well as how others see them. Powerful narratives become brands, and these brands affect everything that we do. And so the questions that we should be asking here is, who are current narratives building power for, and who do they purposely leave behind? And so all of these points just really validate that we cannot afford to leave, just simply ignore narrative impacts on public memory. Another reason, why it's hidden on a larger scale. I know I just went through that list of all of the issues that we found, but just looking at the bigger picture here on local, federal, and state levels in terms of preservation conditions. Like I said before, there's a huge deferred maintenance bill. And so in 2021, the National Park Service had over $11.9 billion worth of maintenance needed across its entire system. In California, it's very similar, with $60 million in 2017. And so the improved preservation efforts that are needed for the hundreds of historically significant African-American places are fitting within that system. You also have inequitable resource distribution. Although there has been an increase in the effort in addressing truth-telling and commemoration of Black history in California and across the nation, we still see a deep need for improved equitable resource distribution on these fronts, because it has gone on for so long. So there's a lot of catching up to do here. Then we have a lack of inclusive planning, lacking inclusive contributions. It contributes inequity, an imbalanced distribution of preservation resources and planning. And this really goes into who is at the table when we're making decisions about historic preservation. Also, underserved and underrepresented preservation networks. That kind of goes hand in hand with the last one that I just shared, but often historically neglected ethnic groups are the stories that are omitted from mainstream public memory and are not necessarily engaged in large numbers with historic preservation. Inequitable preservation policy. Socially and culturally, public historic preservation is not generally equally allotted. Many historic designations lack diversity, inclusion, and equity literally within their language. And so, this is something that needs to be added. It's something that needs to change in terms of processes and practices with policy development. And then this is a really major one, is the underrepresented preservation workers, the underrepresentation amongst preservation workers. And so if you look at this table, you will see that This is from 2020. We have the National Park Service demographics on this line, and then we have the National Race demographics on this line. And so here you'll see that white men are actually overrepresented within the national park system compared to the national race demographics. Black people are underrepresented. Latinx folks, Asian American, and this is, you know, we could go deeper here, but you see that we see underrepresentation here when we compare. And so this doesn't add up. And if you look at California, it's pretty similar. Even though the numbers are different, they're still not fair representation. And so then we get into a question of who's telling the story. And I will add, though, that the National Park Service did literally just announce that they are going to work to build a more diverse and inclusive workforce. And they're putting millions of dollars towards that. So that's actually really great news. And it's something that I think that California parks could probably, you know, follow, and maybe even other states, and, you know, make this a more diverse, diversely represented demographic in terms of employees. And so we also have the issue of the National Register of Historic Places. It was established in 1966, thought to address the denial of access of African American and other marginalized history into the U.S. preservation system. But today, we only see 2% of the 95,000 entries on the National Register of Historic Places that are focusing on the African American experience. Additionally, African Americans, well, these are indicators of a representation issue. Just as with the number of designated sites in history itself, we see African Americans representing less than 4% of academic archaeologists, less than 5% of licensed architects and engineers, and less than 1% of professional preservation workers. For several years now, the American Public Health Association has declared racism as a public health crisis in the US. They're tracking and mapping related declarations and opportunities for action, and have found to date that 21 states, 92 counties, and 147 cities have declared resolutions or formal statements committing to addressing racism. And this is totaling 260 declarations. These are important because it acknowledges and validates the claims of the public health crisis from the APHA. And so we also see a great need, we also see a great effort to silence discussions about race altogether across the nation. And according to this map, we see anti-critical race theory educational efforts happening across the US. For those of you that don't know about CRT, critical race theory, it focuses on US social institutions like the criminal justice system, or the housing market, or the educational system, or the labor market, the healthcare system, and these systems' connections to racism. And this includes racism being embedded in policies and laws and practices and procedures, and that contribute to different social conditions by race. And so here on this map, we see that there's a legislation that will restrict education on race in classrooms or state agencies that has been proposed in purple, and then signed into law, and actually has a budget that has been created in blue, and then failed to pass in red. And this is as of 2022, so this is from last year. So this map has changed a lot of news, you know, especially coming out of the state of Florida. There's news coming out of the state of Florida almost every day. And then also, on the other hand, I do want to also acknowledge in California, on the other hand, in 2021, became the first state to require ethnic studies to earn a high school diploma. And a part of that requires curriculum that is covering the histories of Black, Latinx, Native American, Asian American, Sikh, Jewish, Arab, and Armenian Americans. And so another thing that we, want to think about, the other side of this, is the impact on students and missed opportunities in the U.S. educational system. And so Teaching Tolerance conducted online surveys of 1,000 American high school seniors and more than 1,700 social studies teachers, and they reviewed 10 commonly used U.S. history textbooks. They examined 15 sets of state standards to assess what students know, what educators teach, what the publishers include, and what standards are required related to slavery. And they found that among the 12th graders, only 8% could identify slavery as a cause of the Civil War, and 32% correctly named the 13th Amendment as a formal end of U.S. slavery. 35% chose Emancipation Proclamation. These are some real news headlines that I'm posting up here. These are the consequences to what we are seeing. Here we have questions about why Africans make good slaves concern students and parents. School apologizes for teaching slaves came to America by choice. Atlanta school sends 8-year-olds with math homework about beating slaves. High school under fire for project reenacting slavery. School apologizes after 5th graders asked to make slave auction posters. All real headlines, all very recent headlines. So now I'm going to move into the recommendations and kind of just give a little quick summary on where things are with reparations nationally and in California and how that ties back to the historic preservation. So in California, I'm sorry, not in California, on a federal level, in 1989, this is recent, the late Congressman John Conyers introduced Bill HR 3745. And this was to create a commission to study reparation proposals for the African Americans. And since 1989, the HR 40 bill has been introduced to Congress at every session. In 2021, the Congressional House Committee voted to advance HR 40 to create the commission to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. And this was introduced by Sheila Jackson Lee. And in 2021, it was the first time that HR 40 reached a committee vote, which was a major step. And this was by the House of Representatives Judiciary Committee. The vote, they voted to move the bill to the House floor for a full vote, but that's pretty much as far as it got. There's also, in 2023, Senator Cory Booker introduced S40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals for African Americans, and it was a companion to HR 40. But despite all of these efforts, and some extremely prolonged, we still do not see any real legislative movement for federal reparations. And the legislative process is a long one. We have not seen the progression of the bill as originally hoped for since 1989. Another thing that is important to mention is, and I do want to say that there's a lot going on across the country related to reparations. It's impossible for me to cover it all, but I'm just sharing some of the major things to note. There's the Mayors Organized for Reparations and Equity, and this was a group of mayors who came together and made a commitment to support HR 40 and form reparations advisories committees and commissions and identify funding and work with the committees or commissions to implement pilot reparation programs for Black residents in their cities. And so this is something that you've started to see happen. And this is something that they established in 2021. There's also the Evanston model. And so the Evanston model is in November of 2019, the city of Evanston, the city council adopted a resolution 126 R19 to establish the City of Evanston Reparations Fund and the Reparations Subcommittee. They committed the first $10 million of their municipal cannabis retailers occupation tax, which was 3% on gross sales of the cannabis. And they had set a goal for approximately 400 Black people to receive a $25,000 housing voucher as the first phase. And since the program has started, it was reported in January of this year that only 16 Black people have received reparations in Evanston. This is still a work in progress, though, and they're doing a lot of work there. They're working with other cities, that are doing this, and it's still a work in progress. But a lot of people look to Evanston as a model for what reparations could look like, and to learn from them on what to do. So in terms of what's happening in California, in 2020, California Secretary of State Shirley N. Weber, was then Assembly Member Weber, authored AB 3121, which was the legislation that established the California Reparations Task Force. And in 2022, 60% of Californians support some form of reparations, whether it be cash, monetary, non-cash, or non-monetary. And so the California Reparations Task Force, all of the members that they've been meeting for a couple of years, and they have released their interim report and have identified these 12 areas of harm, which I will be silent for a moment and allow you to just kind of read through them. And so what they are suggesting with these 12 areas is they are actually recommending that, and this is their interim report, so these things may change, they may update these recommendations, but they're recommending that California create a California American Freedmen Affairs Agency, and this agency would serve as a main office or a headquarters, and will be responsible for administering the reparations benefits and more. And the Freedmen's Bureau of the Past was an agency that was developed during the early Reconstruction period and was tasked with providing relief to displaced freedmen in the aftermath of the Civil War and emancipation. And so this is where things are now. So when we talk about a model for reparations in terms of policy, a lot of cities are looking towards, and a lot of reparations efforts in general are looking towards this General Assembly resolution by the United Nations. And these are basic principles and guidelines on the right to remedy and reparation for victims of gross violations of international human rights law. And there are 5 points here of restitution, where we're talking about reversing through freedom restoration, restoring freedom, and recognizing humanity and identity and culture and legal rights. Compensation is exactly what it sounds like. It's monetary, compensation to address economic loss and rights violations and damage. Rehabilitation, we're talking about wellness and well-being. Social services, legal services, health services, mental services. And for satisfaction, we talk about addressing emotional and mental damage, safety, erasure, public apology, commemoration, truth-telling, historic preservation, memorialization, historical analysis, all fall under satisfaction. And it's a culture changing and culture, repair. And then the final point is guarantees of non-repetition. That means that it will not happen again. And there's fair representation and inclusion. in, proceedings and practices and policies and, any type of organized bodies that are in charge, basically. And so I'm highlighting the satisfaction point because this is also used by the African American Redress Network. And they have a map that they have created where they are actually mapping instances of reparations and redress efforts and centering this human rights UN definition of restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. And on the point of satisfaction, first of all, they saw 463 instances of reparations and redress efforts within their map in terms of their tracking that are happening right now. And when we say instances, we're talking about cities or localities or places that are working actively to address the issues that are being faced in terms of racism and human rights violations. And then 207 entries of commemoration and memorialization. This is the most common subcategory. And so this topic of commemoration and memorialization is a very hot topic right now. And 78 entries on historical analysis, which was the second most common subcategory. So I think that's definitely something that's worth uplifting and highlighting that, proves that there is an issue here and it's not just in one place. It's not just here, it's not just there, it's everywhere. Also, this information is very helpful, in looking backwards. In 2008, over 15 years ago, similar data was collected. And the African American National Historic Landmarks Assessment Study evaluated the National Historic Landmarks program within the National Park System. And they found that 10 things were used. They summed it all up in 10 major things in terms of the things that were coming out at the time for African American history. And they found that half of those 10 things were insignificantly covered and needed better interpretation. They also suggested 10 additional things. They, at the time, found 174 National Historic Landmark units that were considered historically significant to African American history, and they proposed interpretation revisions for 47 of the African American landmark locations at that time. And so this was a groundbreaking study, and it really set the stage for what came next in terms of the National Park Service efforts to try to invest more in Black historic sites and their units within the system. And so when we're thinking about Allensworth and Nicodemus and other Black spaces and their shared preservation issues, we're seeing the issues of underrepresentation of the building and the landscape, the environmental and the water, the lack of partnership development, the lack of descendant involvement, the lack of strategic and preservation and business planning, and the lack of funds and resources and no local economy. And when we connect that to Black spaces and places in the historic preservation system, this is what we're seeing through policies and practices and procedures. We're seeing underrepresentation, we're seeing under resource and preservation barriers. There are calls to, there's a movement to decolonize museum collections, and this is going into, other groups as well, and interpretation appropriation, and, being vulnerable to competitiveness, and, the barriers to work and study and preservation careers. And so when we connect these issues of historic preservation to other systems, and we think about like the Black experience in general, these are the things that we see: racism, public health, education, environmental, housing, economic, tourism, government, media, political, business, and community development. All of these things connect back to the historic preservation system. And these issues are being experienced both in and out of the system. And think about the narratives that are coming out and all the barriers that I mentioned. We see a silencing of public education on the narrative and the public memory of the Black experience. And when we think about that silencing, compared to second part of our presentation, where we talked about the official Black reparations policy planning that's happening, and that it's actually requiring historical research on the Black experience. These two things are clashing. And we have to ask the question, where does that leave future generations? And so I want to uplift the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It was created in 2017. The National Trust for Historic Preservation created the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund in 2017. And this program contributes greatly to preserving African American historical locations. Their goal is to expand the American story by centering Black lives. And so since it was created, they've raised over $80 million and provided assistance to over 200 plus African American preservation projects. And I just want to share this quote by the executive director of this fund, Brent Leggs, who has been in the game for a long time and I have great respect for. And this quote is, I think, a call to action that I would like to share with all of you. And that is, with urgency and intention, the public must discuss these issues, ways in which preservation can strengthen its potential to fight for social justice, and investigate the full consequential impacts of these complex issues have on the present. Every preservationist and social impact leader must join forces to develop a preservation-based vision and plan to invest in and restore more assets that hold cultural and financial value, and perhaps most importantly, remain accessible to diverse communities. By preserving these stories' beauty, uniqueness, and significance to historic African-American places, we stimulate revitalization and foster interest in neighborhoods that today seem to exist without history or meaning. Preserving this tapestry of our shared legacy is an act of social justice and should be viewed as a civil right. And so what does this look like in real life? Like, what can actually be done on a local level to address issues? We can look towards the city of San Francisco. They have created a historic preservation commission to center planning on racial and social equity. And this is a multi-year effort. The goal is to identify and document and evaluate cultural, historical, and architectural locations in San Francisco. And this is something that will help guide future landmark designations and to, engage and expand representation for underrepresented communities like Black communities and other communities of color, and also engage the community. And then we have Getty Conservation Institute working with the city of Los Angeles. And this project is been going on since 2020, still, just like Evanston, a work in progress, but it's a start of just trying to create an improved framework for identifying and managing the city's historic resources and uplifting Black history. And then we also have the city of Sacramento, who recently also created a reparations, I believe reparations commission, and is working to collect oral history and oral stories of, the African-American experience in Sacramento. And this documentation, I would imagine, is going to be really important for the reparations work that they're doing in all of these places. As San Francisco actually has already, been well into their reparations work. So this is what that could look like. And all of those government interventions are, still a work in progress, but it's, a step towards reparative justice and acknowledging, where things went wrong in terms of practices and procedures. And so coming to a conclusion now with the recommendations, and these have been developed over time. As I said, when we started this research, things were a whole lot different and they've gotten a whole lot better. And so anyway, first is to acknowledge Black history preservation failures and the value and urgency of immediate attention and the needs for reparative justice within the state and national preservation systems. And so remember that the African American Redress Network data tells us that there's over 280 plus entries on commemoration and memorialization and historical analysis. And these efforts are crucial for addressing the failures. They're a starting point. Then we have, centering representation, equity, and inclusion, and conducting a systematic analysis and prioritizing African-American historic preservation planning. This is, basically what we see happening in some of those cities that I mentioned, and states could also follow these models and do this, including California. The California Parks and Recreation does work with Native tribes in their preservation work, and they have, done a plan for reexamination of like park names, which is really important, but they also, I would recommend extend that comprehensive assessment and approach for addressing other issues related to race within the park system, like hiring and resource allocation and streamlining processes and inequitable practices and things like that. And then we have collaborating to address environmental and social problem conditions around African-American historical locations. So many times I've heard, folks within the park system on state and federal level say that's not our responsibility, that's not why we're here. It's time to think beyond preservation and think about social justice. And if a government entity is in a community where there are issues going on, they should be working with other government entities to address those issues. Also to collect oral history. We've been, the standard historic preservation system has, since its conception, actually not wanted to use oral history, but in the Black community and in other communities of colors, this is how our history is passed down. And so we are seeing more of this, and that's a good thing. We need more of it. And then increasing public outreach to descendant communities, to Black Californians, to youth, and to preservation and reparations initiatives. One thing that I've seen since I have kind of stepped into the reparations movement and the work that I do is there's a lot of disconnection in terms of, preservation workers. A lot of preservation workers that I encounter are not really aware of what's going on with reparations. And that is a huge disconnect because we're, the ones that are going to be helping to collect the history and share the history. And so if you are working in preservation, this is something that you can do, is to keep yourself educated and keep up with what's going on and, find a way to get connected. And then generating sustainable resources for historic buildings, and, for the maintenance. And I mentioned earlier the money that has gone towards Allensworth, which is a great thing. But we definitely need more. And it's not just about the money, but that is very important. Also increasing public knowledge about Black history and the case for reparations, and studying Native American national and international reparations policies. I didn't talk much about this in my presentation because I didn't have time, but there is a lot to learn from Native American, interaction with the government and over commemoration and things like that. And also, I'm gonna go ahead and move on to the next thing. I'm almost there, Oliver. I know you're probably wondering, when am I done? I just have a few more slides. I just want to end on a personal note of what can you do as an individual, because sometimes when I share this, it's like all this big government stuff, but as an actual person, what can I do? One thing that you can do is take the time to learn about your history. Learning about my family history has been a healing process for me. And it is grounding, and it is motivational, And it's something that we all have to face with this history. Some of us may not like what we find, but it definitely can help us to come into this and, just have more appreciation for it. And so take the time to learn about your ancestors, how they were impacted by race and racism, and how it shows up in your life today in terms of your ancestral roots, and commit to lifelong learning and reflection about your ancestral roots. I promise you it will be a healing process. And then I also want to just uplift this concept of social empathy. This is something that we are trying to reach, social justice. This model is by Dr. Elizabeth Segal, and she talks about how it starts with individual empathy, of being just self-aware of who you are as an individual, your positionality, and how you are impacted by the stories that you hear. Like, for example, with Black stories, think about the stories that I just told you about my ancestors. And then gaining a contextual understanding and taking the time to learn about the historical background and the systems and the conditions that are associated with that, and being able to, look at yourself, look at the social conditions that are impacting people that are either a part of a group that you're a part of or a part of a different group, and being able to be aware that they experienced something there that was an injustice or that wasn't okay, and just learning about that, we see more social justice in the world when we practice social empathy. And so this is, when we say, culture changing, this is the culture that we want to get to, is to empathize with each other and to, respect that, even though this may be traumatizing healing, some of it, traumatizing history, some of it is actually, history that is rooted in joy and happiness. Like, think of the picture that Dr. Rosales showed. That was a happy picture, and it made me smile. And when he shared it with me, actually reminded me of somebody that I once knew from Los Angeles that told me about his life growing up and going to Allensworth, and it was a happy memory. And so this is not all bad history. There's a lot of good, happy, and just blessed history that exists within these stories. And so that concludes my presentation. I do want to invite you all to Allensworth. I did speak with the park staff there, and they shared with me these upcoming events. And you can check out their Friends of Allensworth is their partner organization that puts on and co-hosts a lot of these events. The annual rededication is the one that I always try to go to. But the next event is going to be on May 20th. That's going to be the Allensworth May Festival. And then I also would like to invite you to check out other California park sites that have Black history associated with them. And you can find this map actually on their website. We also have our homecoming that's going to be in Nicodemus. We have our homecoming every July, the last weekend in July. And this is similar to the rededication event in Allensworth. And you can check out our website for that. We are going to have a Smithsonian exhibit this year, which we're really excited about. And it's called Voices and Votes, Democracy in America. And it's talking about democracy in America and the story of voting. And we're going to be telling the stories of some of our local politicians who were early settlers in Nicodemus. And lastly, the Black Reparations Project. This is a new initiative that I am working on at Mills College at Northeastern University in Oakland. And my colleagues and I are, working to bridge together folks that are in the movement and conducting research and analysis. We're documenting, and we're basically just looking to provide learning opportunities about Black reparations, and to engage in the process as a higher education academics, and basically offering what we can in that space. And I also wanted to uplift these authors or these scholars. The works of these individuals are also very closely related to a lot of what I talked about today. If you're looking to learn more, you can maybe snap a picture of this slide. I know that I went kind of fast through my slides, so when we get to Q&A, if anybody would like to, for me to go back to any of the slides, I can definitely do that.
Wow, thank you, Ashley. That was absolutely wonderful. And I will remind the audience too that the presentation tonight is recorded. It'll be archived on our social justice YouTube page. And we're also happy to throw on the YouTube page some of the links to some of the resources that you shared tonight. But wow. Thank you, Ashley. That was educational on so many levels, how you're connecting Allensworth to contemporary policy discussions. And the one thing I'm going to take away tonight, like, preservation is a civil right. Oh my God.
I know, right?
I'm going to use that so much now. Oh my gosh. I do want to again shift to a Q&A, but I want to also take a moment to acknowledge any of our Umoja students who are in attendance this evening. Umoja is our campus club that's focused on African American excellence. Yeah.
I know about that.
I definitely want to invite them. If any Umoja students are in the audience and you'd like to ask a question directly to Dr. Adams, please just raise your hand, and Andrew is happy to pull you in to that. So Andrew, I just ask that you kind of monitor and interrupt me if anybody is in fact raising their hand on that. As those folks are considering their questions, I did again want to bring attention to some of the questions that at least surfaced in the chat Q&A. And maybe we can start with one of those. And again, if any Umoja students have their hands up, you can go next. So there was a great question about the role of violence in Tulare County from Cameron Garcia. And so this is, I guess, more of a historical question. And he's talking about isolation. You mentioned that map about how isolated some of these settlements are. And so I guess the question is, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, when you think about the success or lack of success of a place like Allensworth or some of these other instances, can you talk a little bit about the role of isolation, but also racial violence in how those towns, the history of those towns were affected? And again, you can be brief in your response, but I'm just hammering on those two things.
Yeah, I don't really know much about racial violence in Allensworth, but I will say in Nicodemus, in terms of like going way back, like to the 1800s, when they first came, I know that they were in dugouts, and that there is actually a dugout that still exists there today that is in between Nicodemus and the town of Stockton, which is the town that they used to go to get supplies. And they stayed in this dugout like it was a hotel, because the place where they were going to get supplies was a sundown town, and they couldn't stay there. And they had to stay in the cave, basically, as if it were like a hotel. That still exists today. You still can see it today. I won't say that there's a serious racism problem in Nicodemus today, but I will say that the culture of what happened all those years ago, it still lingers, and it's still there in some ways. And so you think about how that impacts people silently. It may not be something that is just outright like, this is a racist town. It may just be that the way that people move are kind of like in a silent, oppressive type of state. And I have experienced that when I was, trying to talk to people, trying to get people to interview with me, of not wanting to talk, and just kind of unsure of who was going to know that they shared what their feelings with me. And so I don't think that it's something that I can really speak that much about, but I definitely think it ties back to the culture of the place today, and the people who live there maybe not even being tying the past to the present like that, if that makes sense.
It does. I appreciate your response. Andrew, I think we have a student perhaps that has their hand raised. Is that right?
Yeah, we have Brianna Crowder from the Umoja program, and she's allowed to speak if she unmutes herself.
Thank you so much. My apologies for such the last minute question. So of course, with the Umoja program, we are very much interested in seeing, and also personally been visiting the parks. Do you have any tips on how to get both students here at BC from other universities and other communities to participate in both the restoration, whether that be through mimicking or ghosting through the parks, or as a lot of our archaeologist majors are trying to dig up old artifacts or give more education? Do you have any tips on that and trying to build a sort of community to help?
Yes, I do. I don't want to put her on the spot, but I do see the Friends of Allensworth President Sasha Briscoe is in the audience tonight. And so I don't know if she would like to speak to that for Allensworth, but I do think that the Friends of Allensworth is definitely an organization that Umoja should partner with and reach out to, to find out how you can work with them, because they're doing a lot of great things in the park.
And I've given her the option to unmute herself if she'd like to say anything to that regard.
Very.
Hi, Sasha.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm well. It's good to see you again.
You too.
Yes, to the question the lady asked, we would definitely love to partner with you guys. Please give me a call at your convenience. We would love to work with you guys. We are definitely looking for younger people to connect with us.
Yes.
Yes, so please call me.
Always want the young people.
Yes, always looking for the young people.
We have some other questions in the chat, Ashley, from Christine Montgomery. She says, hello, I grew up in Allensworth with my family, and my parents were heavily involved in the Friends of Allensworth. I grew up going to the Juneteenth festival as a child. My question is how can we help maybe build the local economy for places like Allensworth, since the park system is underfunded or backlogged?
Mm-hmm. I know that there is at least, and Sasha actually probably, not to just give all this to you, but I'm sure she probably has more recent information than I do, but I know that there are a couple of different groups that are working to build a local economy in Allensworth specifically. And so you could connect with, them directly. But I do think that, again, going through the Friends of Allensworth is the first stop that you should make if you do want to make any connections to Allensworth whatsoever. That's my recommendation.
Thank you, Ashley. We also have a request from Professor Salisbury from CSU Bakersfield. Andrew, can we ping her to speak?
Hello, Dr. Adams. Excellent presentation. I would love to know your thoughts on how they will possibly diversify the National Park Service, particularly the rangers. I was a park ranger at one of their Civil War parks. It was the most amazing job, but it was the most hostile workplace I had ever worked in my entire life. And their institutional racism and structure is deep. I don't know how they're going to fix that. I would love to see a Black Ranger at Allensworth. And it's an amazing job for students, but I would love to write a letter to whoever might be leading that campaign. If you have any idea, what might be your tips to get more students involved in that process? Because it is a great summer job.
That's a really big question. I think it's going to take a long time, and I'm not trying to be discouraging to what they're doing, but it's been the way that it is for so long. And when you think about also that when new administration changes, even though they have this plan in place, this plan could go away with the change of a new administration that could come in a couple of years. So there's a lot that plays into how the new plan gets implemented, and how long it could actually take. And the people within the system who are responsible for implementing it, there's, training that is needed. There's so many policies, hiring policies that need to be reviewed and edited and revised. And we've dealt with this for a long time in Nicodemus, going back and forth with, different staff and different superintendents. We're actually in the process of hiring a superintendent right now as we speak. And we've been trying to get a descendant hired as our superintendent, or, for a long time. And it's been very challenging. So all I can say is the government is really big, and this is going to be a really big process. So don't expect to see it happen, overnight.
Thank you for that response, Ashley. We also have Maya Harget. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. You had a couple of really interesting comments, but we wanted to invite you to speak, especially if you have written a thesis on Allensworth. If you want to share a comment or just maybe mention briefly the work that you've done, if you could raise your hand, Andrew was happy to ping you.
I think you need to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Adams. It's an honor and pleasure. First of all, Allensworth has really inspired me, and my thesis title was actually Allensworth, a legacy of color spelt the British way. And I'm old school. I did focus on the cultural rituals that would have sustained them during the systemics that they faced.
Mhm.
And COVID hampered some of my research, but it inspired me to look from the funny stories I read from there to research women outlaws of color. By doing that, I accidentally came across a newspaper I'm presenting in the fall at the Western Historical Association. I believe that there were McPhersons, because my thesis is on another computer, McPhersons living in Allensworth. I think I've discovered one of their publications, and I'm connecting to other newspapers of color. So I think this might help Allensworth, and the convention is about giving California back to people of color. So besides the Sentinel, does anyone know if Allensworth produced any other newspapers? Because I think they were secretly talking in code to each other through the Black newspapers.
Very interesting.
Yes,
I don't know, Sasha, do you know the answer to that question about the newspaper?
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the Sentinel was the only newspaper that was ever published in Allensworth.
Okay, that's what I thought, because I do have a copy of that, but I believe I'll have to check my notes. If the McPhersons, I think the husband and wife, lived in Allensworth, then I found a publication, because many people lived in two towns. And I think I uncovered their newspaper. I would love to keep in touch and let you know how this is going before my presentation in the fall.
Yes, please do. And I was planning to go to the Western Association conference, but I'm actually going to be at another conference that's happening at the exact same time. So please do stay in touch. I'd like to get your contact information.
Yes, Professor Rosales has it, so I'll email him and he can forward to you. Thank you for your time. And I am a friend of Allensworth. I just got to pay my dues. Bye-bye.
That was wonderful. I love all these connections that are happening. I do want to say this as a kind of getting to a conclusion of tonight's event, because we are going to get kicked out of the webinar very soon. Again, Ashley, I just want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us and having this dialogue. Again, it was really, really informative. And like I said, we're just scratching the surface, it seems, on these larger questions that are going to be, confronting us as Californians, as taxpayers, and where our money goes. And I also just want to cue you to the chat for everyone still here. Please complete our survey. It'll help us gather some data as we submit to our funders and show some of the stimulating impact of tonight's conversation. And 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to be hosting a scholar, James Gregory, who has written on white Okies in the San Joaquin Valley and is now doing really interesting work in the state of Washington. He teaches at the University of Washington on restrictive covenants and Black reparations, and some of the movements in the state of Washington regarding, how we can design housing policies today to address histories and legacies of racial discrimination. So we're really excited. Again, that was not intended to have this reparations theme. It just happened to come across like that. So for certainly everybody in attendance, we will send out that invite in 2 weeks. And again, we're going to continue this conversation about race and inequality and culture in the San Joaquin Valley, but also what we can learn from other community settings. And again, I think, Dr. Adams' work also made us think comparatively about what's happening in Kansas and what's happening in Tulare County in the San Joaquin Valley. So having said that, again, please complete the chat that Andrew has dropped in the link. And again, I want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you for all the attendees, the folks who commented in the Q&A, and most especially thank you, Dr. Adams, for being here. And we wish you the best of luck in all of your work at Mills College and up in Oakland, and for being a voice and a leader in your field in more ways than one. Thank you.
I feel very honored to be here. And I want to also say there's somebody else on the call that is also a community leader in Allensworth, Coyote. And I don't know if he got my message, but I would like to speak with you, Coyote. I just sent you a message. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Rosales, for this awesome opportunity. Much appreciated.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Please complete the survey. If you want to hang out for a little bit, you're welcome to. We just might get kicked out at 7:30. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.